I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the passing of a true heroine of Israel, Miriam Eshkol, the wife of Israel's third Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, who died on Sunday, November 26th, at the age of 87. Few in the American Jewish community knew Miriam's name or were aware of the contribution she made to Israeli life. But Miriam Eshkol was Israel's first lady during the Six-Day War of 1967 and during her husband's attempts to make peace with the Arab world in the war's aftermath. And Miriam Eshkol was known in Israel, where she led a number of important organizations that worked for the social good of Israelis. Well, to give us a sense of who Miriam Eshkol was and how she made her mark upon Israeli life, I'm pleased to have on our JBS phones from Ramat HaSharon in Israel, Dr. Ilan Ben Ami, a political sociologist at the Open University of Ra'anana, and the author of a new book about the wives of Israel's prime ministers entitled Behind the Great Man, the Private and Public Lives of Israel's Prime Ministers' Wives. And Ilan, thank you so much for joining us on JBS.
Thank you for inviting me. My pleasure.
First, Ilan, there's a tradition in America of our becoming familiar with the wives of presidents. In public school, we learn about Martha Washington and Dolly Madison, Mary Todd Lincoln, and more recently, Eleanor Roosevelt, Mamie Eisenhower, Jackie Kennedy, of course, Hillary Clinton, and now Michelle Obama. Ilan, is the same true in Israel? Do first ladies have as much visibility and name recognition in the public eye of Israel?
No, definitely not. Definitely not in the first years when Miriam Eshkol, we're going to talk about her, was in the office. In recent years, it's a little bit more visible, but it's not even close to what you know in the States about first ladies.
So, Ilan, how did you become interested in doing histories of Israel's first ladies?
Well, I guess it helped that I lived for many years in the States and went to school there and became familiar with American
yes.
politics and political culture.
Yes.
And studying Israeli politics and more specifically women in politics, I came with the idea to explore the role of prime ministers' wives in Israel, how different it is, how similar it is, both to the United States and other countries.
You were in the United States studying for what?
Sociology. I got my PhD in sociology in New York.
Where?
CUNY, City University of New York.
Nice.
Graduate School.
Very nice. Where were you born, Ilan?
I was born in Israel, native Sabra.
You're a Sabra, okay. And now you teach political sociology, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You know, by the way, American Jews know nothing about either of Israel's first two first ladies, the wife of David Ben-Gurion or the wife of Moshe Sharett. Were either of them significant in any way?
One of them, well, they were both significant, but one of them was very well known. Obviously, the wife of David Ben-Gurion, excuse me, Tzipora Sharett, the wife of Moshe Sharett, was much less known. I don't think even older people in Israel remember her name or know anything about her. Also because, or due to the fact that Moshe Sharett served for a very short period of time as Prime Minister of Israel.
Yes.
But Paula Ben-Gurion was very familiar and very well known in a much different ways, again, than Miriam Eshkol and later Leah Rabin and our current Prime Minister's wife. But she was known. She was known. She was what we used to say a character.
Yes. By the way, the one Israeli Prime Minister's wife that we do know about was the wife of Yitzhak Rabin.
Probably because he was ambassador to the U.S. It's part of it, I guess.
And because he was assassinated, and Leah Rabin had a very high visibility at the funeral and thereafter, yes?
You know, by the way, that when you spoke about Miriam Eshkol at the beginning of the program, You mentioned that American Jews are not familiar with her. I'm not sure that was true back in the 60s when she was in office, because she joined her husband for a few visits to the States. I think she even made a couple of trips to the States by herself. It was during the Johnson administration and later, I think, Nixon. And she was pretty active in various activities among Jewish communities. So maybe back in the 60s she was a little bit more familiar.
Okay, you may be right. So, Ilan, what can you tell us about the history of Miriam Eshkol, where she was born, how she grew up, some of her early days in Palestine in the 1930s?
Okay, she was born in Germany, but came to Israel. Her family made Aliyah when she was really young, and she went to school. She grew up in Tel Aviv. She went to school in Tel Aviv, and then she joined the Palmach, the Armed Forces of the Free State country. Then she joined the army after the independence. After independence, she was exactly, I think, 19 or 20. So she joined the army, went to university, the regular route that young people do back then. And when she was in graduate school, actually, and came to study in Jerusalem, she hired a room in the Eshkol family. Levi Eshkol was still married to his previous wife. He wasn't prime minister back then. He was a high political figure, but not prime minister yet. And that's how she came to know this family. So that was the beginning of their acquaintance. Then later, Levi Eshkol's wife got sick, and Miriam helped them taking care of her. She became really part of the family. So that's the really beginning of her life and her meeting with the Eshkol family and Levi Eshkol in particular.
Okay, you mentioned a couple of very interesting things. She was 19 and a member of the Palmach. And you should tell our audience, many of our audience knows exactly what the Palmach was and the role it played leading up to the War of Independence and in the War of Independence. But there are also, Ilan, many people who don't know what the Palmach was. First...
Okay, I'll try to make it very brief.
Please.
During the pre-state years, mostly the last 30 years before statehood, between 1919 or 1920 to 1948, the Jewish community in Israel was highly organized, both in terms of social terms, in political terms, and also in military terms. As part of this organization, a few armed forces were created during this time, obviously to protect. We were in the conflict with our neighbors. Did not begin in 1948. It began 50 or 60 or 70 years earlier.
Yes.
So there was a need for armed forces, and the Jewish community organized armed forces in spite of the British mandate, by the way, who didn't like the idea because they were ruling the country.
Yes.
So it was done mostly secretly underground. Yes. And the last military body or organization that was created but was very, very significant is the Palmach, those young people who right after high school or sometime even before they graduate high school, they joined this group of Plugot Machat. I'm not sure about the translation, the direct translation. That was the name of the organization, and it's really considered as the pre-IDF organization.
Yes.
And many young people, both men and women, by the way, both of my parents were part of the Palmach as well, members of the Palmach. They were
really
Miriam Eshkol age. So many young people joined this organization, this military organization, although it was not mandatory. It was pre-statehood, no sovereignty. British were ruling here, but the spirit of volunteering was so high, so many joined this force.
Thank you for that overview. Come back to Miriam. She's married to Levi Eshkol, and again, she knew Levi and his wife at the time, Elisheva. She becomes ill. Ultimately, Miriam becomes Levi Eshkol's second wife. He is not yet prime minister. When he
No,
becomes...
no, he is. He is. She married him. Look, Elisheva died in 1959. He became prime minister in 1963, and he married Miriam in 1964, a couple months after he became prime minister. There were a few years that they were either not in relationship or the relationship were kept, quiet because of obvious reasons. But only when he became prime minister they both came out as couple, and few months later they married.
Okay.
And it's not very important, although it did affect her term as a first lady later. There was a huge age difference between them, and there was also big deal in the Israeli media back then. He was 68, she was 34, exactly half of his age.
And
she was actually younger than his older daughter.
That is fascinating. And you're telling me it became an issue in the Israeli media?
At least, the age difference is always issue. I mean, it's not 10 or 5 or 10 years. This is 34 years different. And it's the prime minister. So, yes, it obviously became an issue, a little issue at the beginning. Then later, I think that she attracted a lot of media attention. She was the first Israeli prime minister's wife that attracted a lot of media attention. And I think part of it is because of the fact that she was, very young, unlike the two women prime minister's wives before her. And she was, she was articulate. She was handsome, I would say, or good-looking. And the media liked her.
Yes. By the way, I understand she was very personable, likable. She was also, it seems, Ilan, very bright. She had a master's degree, and I believe she was working as the Knesset librarian, correct?
That's true. That's true. And actually, she was about to begin her PhD, but then she married him, and she quit her studying in art history. Although she did not quit her job in the Knesset, which was very interesting because she was the only prime minister's wife in Israel history, besides of the current one, which is a little bit different story, who worked full-time or almost full-time during his tenure as First Lady.
Fascinating. You heard me mention most American Jews wouldn't be able to place where Eshkol came in the sequence of prime ministers. But I said, and I hope people understand, he was the prime minister of Israel during the Six-Day War. And after the Six-Day War, Ilan, Levi Eshkol reached out to the Arab League and offered to give virtually all the land that had come under Israeli control during the Six-Day War back to the Arab world on one condition, that they recognized the state of Israel and it was going to be compromised on Jerusalem. And as we know, they go to Khartoum and issue the infamous 3 no's, no negotiation, no recognition.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes. Do not know in any way, do we have any knowledge of where Miriam was on the political spectrum, and did she have any input into the decision to offer the Arab world the land back after the Six-Day War? Do we know anything about that?
Okay, these are two different questions. We know for sure that she was somewhat left to him. I mean, obviously she voted Mapai, or the Labour Party, which he was leading and a member of. But we do have some indications that at some point she went a little bit left, and in later years she even joined the Rats Party, which later became Meretz. She was a very close friend with Shulamit Aloni, the leader of Meretz, which is, it's a part of the labor movement, but the left side of the spectrum of the Zionist movement.
Yes.
Or Zionist left. So she was probably left to most labor voters and activists. I'm not sure about left to him, maybe a little bit. Now, the other question is much more important, obviously, whether she had influence on this particular decision of him. And I must admit that I don't know. I have no evidence for this. I have a lot of other evidence that she was highly involved in his political work during the 6 Days War. We'll talk about it in a second if you want. And even before, and she was a very close advisor of him. So I would guess she had some influence on this decision too, but I have no evidence. You know, as a scholar, I have to stick to evidence.
Okay, very fairly
not to
said.
Speculation.
Very fair. Yes, I do want you to speak to the issue of the 6-Day War in a broader sense. And first of all, I'd love to hear how you feel Israelis and Israeli historians now look back on the tenure of Levi Eshkol during that period. And if there's anything you can tell us about how Miriam was part of anything during that time, it would be fascinating to hear.
Okay, so let's try. I'll try to keep it brief, but still, there are a few issues as far as Levi Eshkol, Miriam Eshkol, and the 6 Days War. First of all, there's the time, the period of time, I think it was 3 weeks before the war, the waiting time, or Tkufat HaHamtana, as we called it in Israel, when he actually prepared the army to the war that everybody knew is about to come, but at the same time he was under a lot of pressure to give up his position. He was both prime minister at the time, prime minister and minister of defense.
Yes.
And he was under a lot of pressure, mostly within his party, to give up his position as minister of defense. Again, at the beginning to Yigal Allon, later to Moshe Dayan, and she really objected it. She really objected it and was very vocal with her objection. Unlike most of his other advisors and close friends, everybody thought he should give up the position, and she said, "No way, no way. You prepare the army to the upcoming war, and you should have the credit for this. If you give up the job to a new minister of defense, he will have all the credit and the fame and whatever."
Interesting.
And at some point, he couldn't take the pressure, and the only single decision that he made without or in contradiction to his wife's advice was to give up his position as prime minister, minister of defense. Moshe Dayan became the minister of defense, and 6 days later, if we to be a little bit dramatic, Miriam nightmare became true because Moshe Dayan attracted all the credit and all the fame for the 6 Days War, whereas he didn't do anything to prepare the army or to be involved. He was Minister of Agriculture at the time before he became Minister of Defense. So that's one thing, that she was very involved in these pressures, but at the same time, that's the only decision that he took contrary to what she thought. Later, during the war itself, she was also very involved. She was sitting in all the meetings, mostly meetings that took place in the home, in the house, not so much in the office, in the prime minister's office, but there were a lot of meetings during the war that took place in their home in Jerusalem, and she was really part of the group that I'm not sure made this. It's not the military decision, but the much wider decision. She was sitting there. She always had what to say. She was taking notes. She was writing his diaries for all these years, and mostly during the 6 Days War, which she as a historian, she understands these are significant days. And she was sitting there taking notes, saying whatever she has to say about it. So she was really part of his team. That's it. That's about the war itself. Now, I think you mentioned in the end of your question the way that the Israeli people remember
Yes.
Levi Eshkol.
Yes.
And that's also a point that Miriam Eshkol, for better or worse, has a lot of significance because, he died in 1969. That's almost 50 years, 48 years ago. And during all these years, almost 50 years, this woman devoted herself both to the commemoration of her husband and to improve his image. She thought from the very first day that history and the Israeli public were not fair towards her husband and his memory and the important role that he played, not only during the Six Days War, during all his tenure. He had almost 50 years of political activity. And she thought he did not get the recognition that he deserved, and she literally devoted herself. She didn't remarry, she didn't have kids, she quit her job, and for almost 50 years, this woman did one and only one thing, trying to improve her husband or late husband's image and to his commemoration, which is quite fascinating, I think.
Absolutely. I believe it's called Yad Levi Eshkol, correct? And and she was chairwoman of that. And what you're saying is she devoted her life to raising Levi Eshkol's reputation in Israel. Incidentally, you're an Israeli. You grew up as a kid. What are kids taught about Levi Eshkol as prime minister?
I think that the one thing that at least I remember as a kid, and I think it was a very vivid image of him back then, that he was very hesitant. He was known for being very hesitant person, a person who could not make a decision. There was this kind of joke that used to run in Israel back in the 60s when he was asked by his secretary or some of his staff whether he wants coffee or tea. He said, half coffee, half tea. Couldn't even decide on this specific thing. And then, by the way, we mentioned the 6 Days War. There was a speech that he gave on Israeli radio. I think it was June 1st, so that's 5 days before the war, 4 days before the war. And there was something in the speech, in the written text, that he couldn't read, and he started to stuttering. And that was also became big deal and also kept his image as someone who's stuttering, who hesitates always. He couldn't make his decision. And I remember, by the way, that Miriam Eshkol also, she heard his speech on the radio. She wasn't with him at the studio or at the office, wherever they took their speech, but she was driving her car, listening to the speech on the radio on her car, and she mentioned in some interview that she gave later that the very moment she heard it, she knew that this is going to be a disaster, and she literally made a U-turn, went back to his office, and tried to save whatever was possible to save at the moment. But it was too late. At least back then, he was and that's the way. The following day, he gave up. He gave the position of Minister of Defense to Moshe Dayan.
Yes.
So this speech also was part of his history and memory.
Well, look, she was a fascinating woman. She did a lot, by the way. We should mention to our audience, she helped establish Beit Halochem, which was a center for disabled military veterans. She was the founding president of the Jewish-Arab Friendship League. She was president
This is, by the way, in my opinion, and studying many other first ladies, both, by the way, in the States and in Israel, I think this job that she took, the Jewish-Arab Friendship League, is the most fascinating because unlike other women who usually took a voluntary job with much more, softer issues that I identified with women, with family, with education, health care, whatever. She took hardcore stuff, highly political issue. I mean, obviously, Arab-Jewish Friendship League was a hardcore political issue.
Yes.
And she was not afraid to put her hand in the fire in this, to take this hot potato, I would call it, and be involved with it. And by the way, that's the only thing that she kept doing for at least a few years after his death and when she was not First Lady anymore.
Again, she sounds like she was a remarkable woman. One last question as we have to end. I could talk to you for a long time. And by the way, Ilan, I hope at some point you'll let me talk about other First Ladies of Israel. But in America, there was a big deal made in the 1960s, the same period we're talking about when Levi Eshkol was prime minister, when women really began to assert a certain kind of independence, the feminist movement, and women became more public, took on more responsibilities. And even up till today, there is still a real struggle for women to feel that they're being paid the same amount of money for the same amount of work, that they have the same choices and opportunities that men here in America do. And at the same time, I look at a Levi Eshkol's wife, Miriam Eshkol. I look at a Golda Meir. I look at them in the Palmach. It doesn't seem to me that the issue of feminism that drove much of American society in the 60s and the decades following was as much of an issue for Israelis, and that it was almost taken for granted, the things that Miriam Eshkol did. To what extent is that an accurate description and distinction between Israeli life and American life?
It is partly. It's partly correct or partly accurate, because at the same time that it was taken for granted, either women or young women joining the Palmach, and women like Golda Meir became prime minister at a very early stage relatively to other countries. Still, in many other issues, Israeli women are much behind. Definitely, obviously, men, but also American women.
Yes.
And, you mentioned the American feminist movement, who was created in the 60s. We always have a saying in Israel that whatever there is in the United States, 10, 15, 20 years later, it arrives to Israel.
Yes.
So it's true in many issues, but it's definitely true in terms of the feminist movement. Early 70s or late 70s, the feminist movement was created in Israel. There was even a party running to the Knesset, to the parliament, under the flag of feminist movement. They didn't do so good, but still, there was a beginning. So obviously, since then, there was a huge progress, and a lot of women, became involved or reached high positions, either in politics and in the army and in other areas of life. But still, I think women has a way to go. The glass ceiling was not broken yet.
All right. But Ilan, I really want you to let me call you and talk to you more about the First Ladies of Israel. You are wonderful to speak with. I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha, and I look forward to many opportunities to sit with you and to speak with you. Thank you for your time.
It will be my pleasure, Mark.
Thank you. The thoughts of Dr. Ilan Ben Ami, a political sociologist at the Open University of Ra'anana and the author of Behind the Great Man, The Private and Public Lives of Israel's Prime Minister's Wives. And again, gave us an insight into Miriam Eshkol, who passed away after really serving not only as a wonderful First Lady of Israel, but also as one who made a major contribution to Israeli life. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, editors, Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.